Listen very carefully because what you are about to hear is not being discussed on CNBC, not being debated on Bloomberg, and absolutely not being explained clearly on crypto Twitter, and yet it is quietly reshaping the XRP narrative right under everyone's nose. Because right now there are 3 XRP insights exploding behind the scenes that, when connected, create a picture so disruptive that most people simply are not psychologically prepared for it. And the craziest part is that this is happening while the majority of retail still thinks nothing is going on, which should immediately make you ask yourself why institutions like BlackRock, Fidelity, the IMF, and even policy-adjacent entities connected to the SEC ecosystem keep circling the same digital asset rails conversation without ever naming XRP directly. And yes, that silence is intentional, because when something truly matters, it is never shouted from the rooftops. It is whispered in boardrooms. Here's the setup, and you need to lock in right now, because XRP is once again sitting at the intersection of regulation, liquidity, and global settlement narratives. And that alone should set off alarm bells in your head, because history has shown us that when those 3 forces align, markets do not move slowly, they violently reprice. And what people are missing is that the current XRP chatter is not about price candles or hype cycles. It is about infrastructure positioning, the kind of positioning that happens months or even years before the public is allowed to understand what is really happening. And while mainstream commentators argue about whether XRP is dead or alive, the real conversation is about whether the rails are already being tested, whether liquidity corridors are quietly being reinforced, and whether certain regulatory chess pieces are being moved into place to allow something much larger to happen without triggering public panic. And if that sounds dramatic, good, because it should. Since every major financial shift in history looked insane right before it became obvious. Now, before we go any further, you need to do one simple thing, because this channel exists for people who want the information before the headlines, not after the price runs. So if you value being early instead of emotional, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications right now, because what we are breaking down today is not for casual viewers. It is for people who want to understand why XRP keeps refusing to disappear despite endless FUD, lawsuits, and coordinated skepticism. And in just a moment, we are going to start connecting these 3 XRP insights in a way that will make you seriously question whether the current market is mispricing risk, mispricing utility, or both. So take a breath, clear the noise, and focus, because once you see this setup clearly, you cannot unsee it. Honored viewers, now we move into the part where things stop sounding speculative and start sounding uncomfortably precise, because the first XRP insight everyone's whispering about is data, not vibes, not hopium, but measurable signals that line up far too cleanly to be coincidence. And this is where names like the IMF, BIS, World Bank, and even BlackRock start hovering over the conversation like shadows. Because if you track central bank reports, cross-border payment white papers, and liquidity stress warnings over the last 18 months, you'll notice a recurring obsession with instant settlement, pre-funded nostro elimination, and regulatory-compliant digital liquidity. And guess what asset architecture keeps matching those requirements again and again, even when the documents never explicitly say the name XRP. And yes, that omission is the tell, because institutions do not advertise their strategic interests until positioning is complete. The second XRP insight builds directly on authority, and this is where the SEC narrative becomes deeply misunderstood by retail, because while people frame the Ripple case as a simple lawsuit, insiders understand it as a regulatory stress test. A line-in-the-sand experiment to define how digital assets with utility will be treated versus speculative tokens. And the wild part is that since the partial clarity events, XRP has not been excluded from institutional conversations. It has been quietly tolerated, which in regulatory language is massive, because tolerance precedes integration. And if you think the SEC, the IMF, and global regulators are not coordinating frameworks behind closed doors while the public argues on social media, you are underestimating how power actually works. And that should immediately make you ask why XRP liquidity metrics, on-chain settlement discussions, and corridor-based usage keep resurfacing in the same breath as global payment reform. And here's the third authority layer that most people completely ignore, which is timing, because financial history shows that infrastructure assets are accumulated during boredom, not euphoria. And right now, XRP exists in that exact psychological dead zone where weak hands lose patience while long horizon capital builds exposure quietly. And when you see BlackRock openly discussing tokenization, settlement efficiency, and digital rails, while XRP remains one of the only assets battle-tested through regulatory fire without collapsing, you should feel uneasy, because markets rarely give second chances at asymmetric positioning. And this is why so many insiders keep hinting that the real move will not look like a normal crypto pump. It will look like a repricing event, fast, violent, and emotionally disorienting, leaving latecomers screaming WTF, just like they always do when data beats narratives. So now that you understand why the data aligns, why authority figures keep circling the same themes, and why timing favors those who are early and patient, the real question becomes what flips the switch? What turns quiet positioning into public chaos? And how the inevitable wave of FUD will be deployed to shake out the last remaining retail before that moment arrives. Esteemed insiders, this is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because the catalyst everyone is waiting for is not a single headline or a flashy announcement. It is a convergence event, and convergence events never announce themselves politely, they erupt. And the XRP insight here is that multiple pressure points are tightening simultaneously. Regulatory clarity inching forward, liquidity stress quietly increasing across global markets, and legacy payment rails showing visible cracks under geopolitical and monetary strain. And when those forces collide, something has to give. And historically, it is always the outdated system that breaks first, not the technology built to replace it. And this is exactly why XRP keeps getting dragged back into the spotlight whenever cross-border settlement, instant liquidity, or digital infrastructure is discussed at the highest levels. Now let's talk FUD, because this is where most people get wrecked psychologically, and you need to understand this clearly. The louder the FUD becomes, the closer the event usually is, because fear is not random, it is deployed. And when you start seeing recycled narratives like XRP is centralized, Ripple controls everything, banks will never use crypto, or regulators will kill it at the last second, that is not organic skepticism, that is emotional exhaustion warfare designed to make you second-guess your positioning right before the narrative flips. And the proof is historical, because the same playbook was used with Amazon before e-commerce dominance, with Tesla before EV adoption, and with Bitcoin before institutional custody, and yet people still fall for it every single cycle. What most viewers do not realize is that catalysts often appear boring on the surface: a regulatory update, a policy framework, a liquidity pilot, a corridor expansion, but the market reaction is never boring, because the smart money has already modeled the impact months in advance. And when confirmation hits, there is no debate, only execution. And this is why XRP insiders keep hinting that the next move will not be about hype. It will be about validation. The moment when doubt collapses under its own weight and price has to mathematically catch up to reality. And that is when the same commentators spreading fear today will suddenly pretend they always believed in the technology. So ask yourself this brutally honest question. If XRP were truly irrelevant, why does it require constant attacks, constant dismissal, and constant explanation? Because irrelevance does not need defending, and relevance does not need shouting. It simply moves when the timing is right, and the signs suggest that timing is compressing, not expanding. Which brings us to the part everyone really wants to understand, but few are emotionally ready for: the price justification, the mechanics behind a potential repricing, and the final warning most people ignore until it is too late. Distinguished holders, this is where emotions get tested and logic either takes control or collapses, because price is not magic, it is math, psychology, and liquidity colliding at speed. And the final XRP insight is that the market has likely been valuing XRP as a speculative token when the underlying thesis increasingly treats it as infrastructure. And that mismatch is where explosive repricing comes from, because infrastructure is not valued on memes or vibes. It is valued on throughput, reliability, regulatory survivability, and integration potential. And when you start framing XRP through that lens, the current price starts to look less like a fair valuation and more like a placeholder, a temporary number waiting for a narrative confirmation event. Consider this. Global cross-border payments move trillions daily, not yearly, daily, and even a microscopic efficiency capture can justify valuations that look insane to anyone still anchored to retail trading logic. And this is why comparisons to past cycles fail, because if XRP transitions even partially into a recognized liquidity bridge roll, price does not rise gradually, it gaps, because liquidity assets reprice when demand becomes structural instead of speculative. And that is when you see sudden vertical moves that leave charts looking broken and people screaming that it makes no sense, when in reality it makes perfect sense. They were just looking in the wrong direction. Now here is the final warning. And this is not said lightly. Most people do not miss wealth because they lack information. They miss it because they cannot emotionally tolerate uncertainty, boredom, and ridicule at the same time. And XRP has been engineered by the market to feel uncomfortable, slow, and frustrating for as long as possible to filter out anyone without conviction. And when that filter completes its job, the move happens fast, violently, and without mercy for late entries. And the worst part is that by the time mainstream media starts explaining why XRP suddenly matters, the opportunity window has already closed for meaningful positioning. So before this wraps up, understand this clearly. No one rings a bell at the bottom, no one sends invitations before a repricing, and no one apologizes after the fact, and whether you act or not is irrelevant to the market. It will move regardless, leaving only one question that actually matters. Were you positioned before the shift, or were you waiting for permission? Boys, this is where everything locks into place, because the 3 XRP insights we just walked through are not isolated theories. They are a pattern, data aligning with authority, authority aligning with timing, and timing compressing into inevitability. And history is brutally clear about what happens next. Markets do not reward consensus. They reward conviction before clarity. And XRP has spent years being dismissed, misunderstood, and deliberately oversimplified while quietly surviving regulatory fire, technological scrutiny, and narrative warfare that would have destroyed weaker assets. And that survival alone should tell you something profound about what role it is being prepared for. The uncomfortable truth is that by the time XRP's relevance becomes socially acceptable to talk about, the asymmetric opportunity will already be gone because infrastructure assets reveal their value suddenly, not slowly. And when the switch flips, there will be no polite entry, no calm accumulation phase, only a violent repricing that forces everyone to mentally rewrite their assumptions in real time. And that is when regret becomes louder than doubt, and people start saying they always knew, even though their actions proved otherwise. So this is your moment of honesty, not with me, but with yourself, because information without action is entertainment, and action without conviction is gambling, and XRP sits right at the crossroads of those two realities, daring you to choose which side you are actually on. And whether this ends up being remembered as the asset you ignored or the one you had the discipline to understand early will depend entirely on what you do before the narrative changes, not after, because once it changes, it is already too late, and the market never looks back.